We have been talking already today about this term toxic masculinity, which is a term that's being used across the internet, along with other terms like virulent masculinity, to describe a phenomenon that many people are observing. Not just after terror attacks of the kind we've seen recently, but in terms of all kinds of violent crimes, and in terms of football hooliganism, internet trolling, abusers of every kind, it seems, hate crimes in particular. Why, if this is the case, why, overwhelmingly, are the perpetrators men? Masculinity. Dr. Anthony Ellis is with us, who teaches sociology and criminology at the University of Salford and is the author of Men, Masculinities and Violence. Anthony, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much for joining us. First of all, before we try to explain some of this, is it true as a phenomenon, when we look at our prisons and look at violent criminals, when we look at violence of all kinds in our societies, do men have a particular relationship with violence?
Well, it was written by a very important criminologist once that the closest that criminology has ever come to establishing a fact is that the vast majority of violence is committed by men. But obviously, this is a relationship that is not simplistic. There's a lot of complexity here. And there's a lot of social factors that are very, very important in understanding this relationship.
And that's explaining it, but let's just dwell for a second or two on the fact of it. When we look at our prisons, what do we see? In
prisons, most of the, if you're just looking at England and Wales, for example, the prison population is overwhelmingly men. Smaller numbers of women make up the prison population here in England and Wales.
95% male?
Yeah, roughly that, overall.
How do you explain that?
There are a number of ways that you can potentially explain it, and there are a number of different arguments and theories that have been put forward by scholars looking at sort of biology. Is it something genetic about men? But the issue there is that that's far too deterministic, and it doesn't deal with the fact that we're not talking about all men here. We are talking about a specific group of men that are using violence more regularly and more persistently. So we have to look to other reasons and other explanations.
So you're saying let's not say it's hormones, let's not say it's testosterone, let's not say it's genetics. It's not in the DNA of men. It must be something then more social.
Potentially, yeah. Certainly in the work that I've done, a lot of the individuals that I've done work with come from quite specific backgrounds and have got quite specific relationships with violence, which are related much more to sort of more psychological issues and social issues and socio-economic issues in particular.
One can look at the black population of prisons in the United States, and some racists in the United States, as we've heard recently, have drawn this connection and said, well, there's something about black people that means that they are more likely to commit crimes. That doesn't follow, of course, for the same reason. It might be that you look at the social and economic background of black people in the United States. It might be that you look at the behaviour of the police, and you might find, for example, with drug crimes, that black people are more likely to be arrested than white people who also engage in drug crimes. Is that the kind of analogy you might make with men?
I think it's a difficult one in terms of making comparisons with obviously the situation in America. I think the history of America in particular and the history of the Jim Crow regime and slavery example is very, very pertinent and important in understanding the situation with imprisonment over in America. I think the issue here in the UK in relation to men and violence is that I think, again, if we're looking at the research, a lot of the research tells us that a large proportion of violent crime is committed by men. And it's about trying to understand, well, what is that relationship? But again, we're talking about quite specific groups of men here. And again, I think what's important and has come through in some of the work that I've done and that other people have done is that there are issues around social and economic factors which are very, very important, and how psychological factors as well kind of intermingle with some of that. And that helps us arrive at what arguably might be more better explanations for why we're seeing this phenomenon.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Anthony. Anthony Ellis from the University of Salford. Holly Combe is with us, writer from The F Word, the online feminist magazine, and Mike Buchanan from the political party Justice for Men and Boys. Welcome to both of you. Good afternoon. Mike, your response to this phenomenon that has been described as toxic masculinity, not that all men are toxic, not that masculinity is toxic, but that there are toxic dimensions to masculinity which are reflected in those figures we've just been hearing about.
The term toxic masculinity is an insulting feminist invention. It derives from feminist convictions that women are superior to men. And I'm very pleased we've already started on the prison population because Dr. Ellis is quite right. 95% of prisoners are men. But the reason it's such a high figure is perfectly well understood, and William Collins in a blog piece calculated that if men were sentenced to prison at the same levels as women for the same crimes, 5 out of 6 men in British prisons wouldn't be there.
So you think it might be the behaviour of the criminal justice system rather than men?
Indeed, so it's not just in sentencing. The criminal justice system is woefully poor at addressing female criminality and violence and fails to punish the women properly. So in case after case of women charged with inflicting bodily harm, even quite extreme harm at times, magistrates and judges pass suspended sentences. In other words, no punishment at all. And we know in a domestic context that of domestic violence, that when the violence is one way in a heterosexual couple, the perpetrator is twice as likely to be a woman as the man.
Holly, your thoughts on some of that, and also this concept of toxic masculinity?
Yes, I thought it was interesting what Anthony Ellis mentioned about the prison population. I think that can be indicative of how the idea of masculinity. I mean, it's already been stressed that this is not about men. I don't think it's about, as Mike was saying, the idea that women are superior to men. It's just not true. No one gender's superior to another. But the idea that this sort of toxic idea of masculinity, the ideal, be strong, be a man, you can't back down,
man
all
up.
This sort of thing. It can,
when do you ever hear someone saying girl up? Yeah.
Yeah, and exactly, it's toxic to men themselves. And so you have men who get dragged further and further and further into behaviours that, they can't get out of because it's being imposed on them. And actually, that is a real problem for men. And, it's creating that problem of the prison population that was being talked about. So I think, as well, when we think about toxic masculinity, I think it's important to think about how that's toxic to men themselves.
Where does the toxicity come from? Do you think there's a social expectation of men to behave aggressively?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, I think that things sort of improve a little bit and then they go backwards. But yeah, I mean, sort of phrases like you run like a girl, sort of men not being able to show emotion, I think it damages men. And I think also it's a mode of masculinity that sets itself up against sort of so-called femininity and is reliant on demeaning women. And I think masculinity, it can be defined in other ways that don't necessarily do that. I don't necessarily have a concrete definition of it myself, but I think when it doesn't set itself up to demean people who are seen as weaker or more feminine, I think it doesn't have to be a negative thing. But I think this is what's meant by toxic masculinity, this form of masculinity that says you have to be strong, you have to not back down, you have to overpower others. And I think that's what's toxic. So
this could be about social expectations on men, Mike, and it could be liberating for some men to abandon those social expectations.
Well, yes, but the social expectations are those of women. Women expect men to be strong, and women are not attracted. Women are not attracted to feminine men.
Well, some are, clearly.
A leading feminist once said that if it were not for men being masculine, we'd all still be living in caves, and it was a rare example of a feminist saying something correct.
Who said that? Which feminist?
It was either Gloria Steinem or Germaine Greer.
What was the quote again? I missed it.
Well, she said that if it were not for men being masculine, we'd all still be living in caves. We reject the concept of toxic masculinity in its entirety because it's one of countless feminist shaming tactics, and we scorn them all.
I don't think it is.
Holly,
I don't think it is. I don't think it is a shaming tactic because it's not saying that this is something innate. That's it's not an innate problem with men themselves. There's all these men and boys who have such potential and who
they can't help themselves. Yeah.
Well, it's not that it's not that they can't help themselves.
No, I'm saying you're not saying that.
Yeah, exactly. You're not saying that. And so I think the idea that it's damaging to men, and I don't think it's a way of shaming men and saying that men in and of themselves are terrible. It's saying that this idea that we have that is very prevalent in society about masculinity is toxic. And again, I don't think there's anything shaming about that.
Do you
it doesn't
think
come
there's
from
an
the
equivalent?
idea women are superior to men.
Sorry to talk over you. Is there an equivalent for women, Holly? Is there such a thing as toxic femininity?
Well, I kind of think that there can be. Yes, I think there can be. I think that it can be toxic to, again, like with what I was talking about for men, I think it can be toxic to women, ourselves. The idea that we have to always be attractive to men or always have to look a certain way and not allowed to get older and all this sort of thing. It can be very damaging to somebody's psyche. So yes, it is toxic. And also, if we're going to get into the outer stuff, I think certain ideas about chivalry and, sort of men having to look after women, I think that there is a form of sort of toxic femininity, if you will, a traditional idea of womanhood womanhood that is toxic to women themselves and also to men. So yes, I think there can be. I think these traditional ideas about gender, whether it's masculinity or femininity, they are toxic.
One text coming in, 81771 for your text, incidentally. One unnamed text says, male domestic abuse victims are more likely to be arrested than female domestic abuse victims. That's the claim, or the perpetrator, is the claim in that the system is somehow geared towards arresting men rather than women, Holly.
Well, I think that there is a traditional idea that a man is more likely to be perpetrated. But if you actually look around, like this article that was written by, was it Una Mullally? Is that how you pronounce her name?
Una Mullally's been writing about this in the Irish Times,
yes. As her article was saying about, these guys, with Charlottesville, there's a lot of anti-woman rhetoric on the internet coming from these men. So there is a connection there. These are examples of men, a loud minority, if you will, as sort of going back to something that Anthony Ellis was saying, who have absorbed these toxic ideas about masculinity. And of course, going hand in hand with that, there's a lot of woman hating as well. But again, this is a loud minority. This is a minority of men who've so absorbed these ideas that they're actually doing immense damage. And that does need to be looked at, but that's not in any way the same as saying that somehow men are terrible or men are awful. And yes, going back to the example about violence, there is a traditional idea that a man is more likely to be overpowering a woman. But I think, unfortunately, gender roles have been as such that does tend to be the case. But yes, absolutely, if there is a violent woman, it's very difficult for someone who's on the receiving end of that, man or woman, to be listened to, because there are still a lot of people who believe that women are soft and non-violent, and that's incredibly damaging. We're not. We're just as able to be violent as men. It's just that we're not as enabled to do so.
Mike Buchanan.
Yes, gosh, different way to start. If I can just talk about the narrative that men don't talk about their emotions. We had in our 2015 General Election Manifesto 20 areas where the human rights of men and boys are assaulted by the state, almost always to privilege women and girls. And one example is in the area of support for domestic violence victims. And you ask yourself, who is it in the UK who runs the domestic violence refuge industry, and it's radical feminists. In terms of one-way domestic violence, 2/3 of that is carried out by women. But there's virtually no provision for there's virtually no provision of support for men. So battered men very often end up in the street homeless, and they lose an average of 30 years of life expectancy.
My goodness. And have a lot less sympathy, it's said. From people in society as well, Mike. I've heard that claim.
Well, it's the empathy gender gap. It
the empathy gender gap.
Yeah, it manifests itself in so many areas. So you take in England, there are two national screening programs for gender-specific screening programs for cancer. Both of them are for women's cancers. Although the most common women's cancer, breast cancer, is less common than men's prostate cancer. It is always the same. Resources and sympathy go towards women and girls at the expense of men's and boys' human rights.
Siobhan O'Neill's been tweeting on this. You know Siobhan, Professor Siobhan O'Neill, who's an expert in mental health, and said we need to note that this is also a factor in suicides, because it is significant that the biggest cause of death for under 45-year-old men in the UK is suicide. You've heard there's a stark figure around there. Most are male. And remember, we are not saying that masculinity is toxic, she's saying in that, but we have to have a conversation about the dynamics, what links all of these things together. The problem is when you try to have this conversation, even a nuanced conversation where we start with an academic who gives you some of the evidence, and then we bring in Holly and Mike to explore this context and the dynamics, you get a text like Paul in Dungannon saying, here you are, the BBC telling us anything masculine is bad, anything feminine is good. No, we didn't. No one in this conversation has said that, Paul. I'm not sure which programme you're listening to, but we're trying to do this in a nuanced way. No one has said that. Others are misreading what we're saying about Charlottesville and suggesting that it's all the fault of feminists. Who suggested that in this conversation? Am I alone in thinking this? Somehow that when we get into this kind of conversation about men, masculinity, femininity, Mike, people superimpose their prejudices on the conversation. Mike?
Can I possibly come in here to talk about suicide?
Please do.
30 years ago, the the ratio of male to female suicide in the UK was 1.7 to 1. A year or two back, it passed 3.5 to 1, and it's still rising. And the state does absolutely nothing. If the genders were reversed, the state would be pumping billions of pounds into reducing into reducing female suicide. And you look at I mean, virtually every reason why men commit suicide is related to the state's actions and inaction. So, for example, men denied access to their children after family breakdowns by an utterly corrupt family court system. I mean, you know, if you deny someone access to their children, don't be surprised, you know, when they jump in front of a train.
I'm sure all the judges in the family court system would deny fundamentally the claim that they're utterly corrupt or the system's utterly corrupt. I'm sure also that many people working in the criminal justice system, Mike, would say that there are dynamics we need to learn about and dynamics we need to actually challenge so that we have fairness in the system. No system is perfect. Here's another text to the programme. I love, who changes your car when it's got a flat tyre? Hi, William. This seems to be another example of feminist misogynists trying to feminise and degrade men. Even the term masculinity now being used in the derogatory sense of toxic masculinity. Holly, deal with that one.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I don't. As I think you've outlined very well, I don't think that that's what's being said. I think our discussion is much more nuanced than that. But I'd like to go back to what was being said about screening for cancer, suicide, and also, as well as that, the stuff about parenting, because I think it links into it. I'm really glad that you mentioned that, Mike, because I think there is this sort of, if you look across the board with the genders, the traditional idea, I think that basically the problem that women have is that we are more cherished but less respected, and the problem that men have is that they're more respected and left to get on with it, but they're not as cherished. So men's lives end up being devalued. There's less screening. There's less attention paid when men kill themselves. There's, you know, all those things are absolutely true.
Right.
But the kind of trade-off of that is that men are left to get on with it. Men are assumed to be independent. They're not constantly being invaded, examined, being told what to do. It's probably got something to do with, you know, kind of ideas about biology, that a woman is cherished because she's seen as the vessel for the children, or this sort of thing. And it's very oppressive to women because it means that we're always being hounded. We're always being told to go to this screening and that screening. Our lives are valued, but we're being controlled. And that's the problem. And that's to do with patriarchy. But it is also, you know, the downside of patriarchy for men with that is that their lives are not being valued. Men are not being told what to do. They're not being cared for, basically. When a man is upset, when a man is feeling suicidal, people aren't paying attention because they're assuming he can look after himself. And that is damaging and that is wrong.
It's an interesting
and I would
claim.
stand up against that as much as you.
It's an interesting claim, Mike Buchanan, that men can be victims of patriarchy too.
It's an absurd feminist narrative. Honestly, I don't know how I didn't laugh out loud at that one. But you know, the reason men are independent and stoic and all these other sort of traditional masculine characteristics is ironically, it is related to what Holly was just saying, that the society doesn't care for men.
Well, yes. So why would you laugh out loud at me saying that? You seem to agree.
Yeah, no, but it arises. I mean, male disadvantage is the other side of the coin to female privilege. Female privilege leads to male disadvantaging because, for example, in the case of domestic violence shelters, because radical feminists hoover up virtually 100% of the money available, there is no support for male victims of domestic violence. And this is something done by women and by feminists specifically.
I don't think it is. I don't see. Most of the feminists I know are not arguing that women are somehow these sort of pure, lovely creatures who need protecting, and that men are all evil and nasty. I think it's much, much more complicated than that. And I think there do need to be more provisions for men. And I don't think a lot of feminists would argue with that. They're simply arguing that there need to be provisions for women because of this patriarchal structure that can lead to certain kinds of violence. But that doesn't mean. I mean, I think a lot of the ideas that need to be unpicked, I think, to do with femininity is, chivalry. I don't know whether we might end up sort of not actually having that different views on that there is a toxic sort of chivalry, if you like, that protects women and upholds men and assumes that men always have power and control. And I do think that needs to be deconstructed. But I don't think that feminists are arguing for 1 minute that men somehow don't need care or attention, or that men don't suffer.
But I mean, it's one thing what feminists say and another thing what they do. And I go back to our manifesto where there's 20 areas, and probably 18 or maybe 19 of them, where feminists have campaigned long and hard and they're at the heart of the establishment, making sure that women are privileged and men disadvantaged.
But why don't
although men pay 75% of the income tax that keeps the state going?
But surely men's rights activists, if men's rights activists, rather than saying that toxic masculinity is a feminist invention and saying that feminism is the problem, if men's rights activists are, and I'm sure there are men's rights activists who do this, are campaigning for specific services for men, I don't think feminists would argue with that. I think, why not spend the time doing that? Why is it feminists' place to campaign for services for men? Yes, we can argue for it and say that we support that, but there's nothing wrong with women and feminists who are highlighling women's issues to be campaigning for that. It doesn't have to be at odds with men's services.
It doesn't have to be a gender war, in other words, does it?
No, it doesn't.
I'm afraid there will have to be a gender war, because feminists are pushing at an open door when they're trying to get privilege, and men are pushing at a locked door when they're trying to get equal rights.
I thought that you said that women already have privilege, that this is female privilege, and you just said trying to get privilege. I think that's quite interesting.
No, I'm saying feminists campaign to get ever more privilege.
But I don't think that's...
Feminism is a pursuit of female privilege, regardless of the cost to society.
I really don't think it is. I don't think we're pursuing a privilege. We're pursuing equality. And absolutely, the give and take and push and pull of pursuing equality is an ongoing discussion. And
we have only got 20 seconds, Mike. I want to give you a chance to respond.
Okay.
Yeah, Holly, that's nonsense on stilts. I defy you to name me one area where I have human rights and you don't.
It's not. I think that we both have human rights, and we should have human rights. And I really don't. What human rights are you referring to?
Well, for example,
I did warn you. We just had 20 seconds. I'm afraid it's up. Mike Buchanan, Holly Combs. Got to leave it there.
Thank you.
Sorry to both of you. Got to leave it there. Thank you very much.